We made this.
Hello all, and welcome to another edition of Pick a Disc. I'm your host Matt Latham, and this is the podcast where someone picks a disc to talk about for whatever reason they want to. And today I'm happy to welcome on the guest, which is Russ from the Infectious Groove podcast, to talk about Sturgill Simpson's A Sailor's Guide to Earth from 2016. Interesting conversation, and fascinating conversation actually, because it starts to dip towards sort of genres I'm not too au fait with. So I learned a lot about country and outlaw country music, and I'm hoping that you get a bit of education if you're not familiar with it as well, because I learned quite a bit about what outlaw country is, and I look forward to unveiling the conversation that we have in a minute. But before I unveil the conversation, just a reminder that you can follow us on all your social medias if you want to under Pick a Disc. I know I'm on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, not on TikTok because I tried it and felt really old. But yeah, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter under Pick a Disc. And as always, there's the Discord that you can find the link to in the show notes. And that's everything on the list that I need to do. So yeah, let's talk to Russ. Before the record, I was talking to my guest Russ just basically about time zones and how thankful that he's apparently an early bird. So I think it's about 8 a.m. in Florida. Is that correct?
Yep, one of the southernmost parts of the United States. So yeah, I'm way down here where it's much warmer than where I'm originally from in Detroit, where about this time of year in Detroit, we all get that feeling of, boy, it's been a great summer and I'm looking forward to, oh no, it's going to freeze for 3 months, and now I don't have that anymore. So
do you miss the cold? Do you miss the cooler weather?
Yeah. Down here, people keep saying that it's overly hot. Like back home, friends of mine, oh, I can't believe the heat you're dealing with, because it is considerably hotter during the summer months, but it's not too hot for me during the summer. And then the winter, it doesn't get down to -19 like I've experienced in Detroit. So
yeah, okay, yeah. At the moment in the UK, it's okay. It's not blistering heat. That's very concerning, and it's not freezing. So it's just right. So I spent most of the morning doing stuff in the garden, and yeah, I didn't have to wear a jacket, and also didn't feel like I was about to burn to death. So, but again, being British, I could end up spending an hour talking about the weather, and that's a stereotype. That's a stereotype I think I'll try and avoid for today. But yes, Russ from the Infectious Groove podcast is the guest for today, and he's brought an album along to talk about. So Russ, tell the lovely listeners the disc that you've picked for today.
The album that I brought to the table for today is Sturgill Simpson's Sailor's Guide to Earth, which is from mid-2016, and it is just, we're going to go through a lot of points about the record, but to me, it's got to be in the discussion with best albums I've heard in the past decade for any genre, really. And I think that, and again, I know that we'll get into finer points about this, but I feel like almost no matter what genre you listen to, maybe outside of rap, there is something for you on this record. Like, I don't care what your personal favorite genre is, whether it's rock or R&B or country itself, or even jazz to a certain extent. There's something for you on some part of this record. It's just an astounding album, in my opinion.
I think that answers why you picked it. So how did you discover Sturgill Simpson then? How did you come to learn of his existence?
So this is kind of interesting. So Sturgill is one of those artists that was always, I was kind of adjacent to. Like, I knew of him. And I actually knew people that knew him in his early days, because I had a lot of friends who lived around, or still do have a lot of friends that live around the Nashville area where he is. And they would always tell me that, oh man, there's this guy coming up, Sturgill Simpson, you got to hear him. And I don't know why. Well, I guess I shouldn't say I don't know why. I'm not a huge fan of what is out there in modern mainstream country these days. So it's hard for me to open my mind. I almost always, whenever somebody says, oh, you should hear this new artist, and they're out of Nashville, or they're a country artist or whatever. And this is absolutely my fault as a listener, but I kind of go in with a preconceived notion, and I'm like, if I get to that, I'll get to that. Mm-hmm. But I'm almost afraid of what it's going to be like. And then we used to do this thing back when I lived in Detroit. We did it for 9 years. It was simply called Music Night, and we every single Friday night for 9 years, we would have people over to our house to either I had at the time I had an extensive vinyl collection. I had like 1,500 LPs or so, and so people were encouraged to come and dig through my record collection and find things either they hadn't heard in forever, or artists that they wanted to hear but they never got around to, or something entirely new to them. But people were also encouraged to bring their own records and things I may not own or may not have heard, or something that's out of my wheelhouse. And when this album came out, about, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks after it came out, a person who used to come to Music Night regularly brought this album with them. And I had not heard one note of it. I hadn't even listened to Sturgill yet, but I knew who he was. And, my friend said he was very familiar with the first 2 albums from Sturgill. And he said, you're not even ready for this. Like, this is a masterpiece. You have to hear this album. So we dropped the needle on it, with me not having even heard one note of Sturgill Simpson previous to this. And I was just blown away. Like, and it became an album that first of all, I ran out to buy it like the next morning. I couldn't even get in the car fast enough to get to the record store to go buy my own copy. And second of all, it became a regular record that, like, I mean, we listened to so many different types of genres and different albums and things over the years, every single Friday. But this one, I would say, got played in its entirety at least like every other week, every third week, something like that, because it's just so good that it kept coming. We kept coming back to it, and we kept playing it for other people that we thought might appreciate it as well. So yeah, that's how it happened all at once. I heard Sturgill Simpson for the first time while listening to this record and this record at the first time, and just was completely head over heels in love with it.
Couple things, slight tangent that I picked up on. So you had like a music listening night every Friday for like 9 years straight. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what was that? Was that like just you and friends? Was it a community thing, or just...
Yeah, it was me and friends of friends. And just say, hey, if anybody ever came, say, oh man, my buddy would love this or whatever. Okay. The only rule I had was, you're welcome to bring anybody here, but if you wouldn't have them in your own house, don't bring them to mine. So so if you have that friend that your wife hates because he's always breaking things in your house, or like that don't bring him here. But that was really the only rule that I had. And then outside of that, it was bring whatever music you want to hear. And it was funny, we used to have to remind people that I don't believe in guilty pleasures. Like, if you love a song, then you love a song, and there's nothing guilty about that. So we used to get people that would go dig in my record bins, and they would say, like, come back, and they'd come back with like Pearl Jam or Soundgarden or Johnny Cash or something that they perceived to be cool. And then, like, they'd say to me quietly, oh, I really wanted to listen to Culture Club, but I didn't want to get made fun of or something. And I would be like, well, I own it and it's my house. Like, like, somebody starts making fun of you for listening to Culture Club, like, they're going to be asked to leave, but over time it was so funny because I got turned down to tons of music that I'd never heard, because people would bring records from artists that I'd never heard, or genres that weren't really my wheelhouse. But also, and this was kind of a running joke, we used to have people who would be like, I can't come to Music Night this week because it costs me $200-300 like each week, because they would sit at the table and hear something they love and just be making putting things in their cart on Amazon on their phone, like, like, well, now I gotta buy this record, and I had at least 2 people who would like sit it out every couple of weeks, because they're like, I can't afford to come to Music Night because I'm gonna end up spending $200-300 between Amazon and the record store, and the only reason why we discontinued it is because I recently moved to Jacksonville, so I can't do it from 1,000 miles away. But it was an incredible experience for the 9 years that we did it. And the only time we ever didn't do it on a Friday night was if there was a concert that I was going to as the host or whatever, that happened to fall on a Friday. And even those weeks, most of the time we tried to have it on like Saturday night or whatever that week instead, but it was very, very cool experience. And to see people I can't stress enough, I wasn't excluded from this, but to see people find new music to be passionate about on a regular basis was really, really, really rewarding. And for me too, like I say, I can't count the number of times somebody would slide a record and say, "Hey, if you get a chance, can you play this?" And, during tonight, and I'd say, "Well, what is it?" And they, whatever, it's this genre, this guy's new, this band, or he used to be in this band and now he's solo or whatever. And 9 times out of 10, I would end up loving what it was that someone else brought that I'd never heard before. So it was just really, really, really rewarding experience from a music standpoint,
Wow, that sounds really, really good. And we know who to blame when pretty much a lot of independent record stores in Detroit suddenly go out of business.
Right. Yeah.
So we
It's
know
funny
who to
that
blame.
you say that, because I did have a really extensive collection. And by the end, by way of a very long story, I decided that I wasn't going to take my whole collection with me. So I brokered a deal with there's a lot of major, very good independent record stores in Detroit, but I brokered a deal with one of the stores there that's a family-owned business that I like a great deal, to purchase my entire collection from me instead of me moving it. And what's funny about that is it's helped put them on the map as a go-to record store in Detroit, because of how many different rare pressings that I had, and how many, like, at a minimum rare in the US pressings that I had and things like that. So like now they're going through and selling off my collection little by little, but it's helping their family business, because prior to this, they just had the new release vinyl like everybody else had, and you could really go anywhere in Detroit and buy that, including, Target and Walmart. You could just walk into mass retail and buy new release vinyl. So it feels good to me to know that my collection ended up helping put a local business on the map more, and they're also, besides being family owned, they're very, 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 into making sure that people who appreciate the music are buying the music. So they're making sure that, it's a rare Van Halen record that I had wasn't just going to a guy who's going to never play it, or worse, put it on Discogs or eBay and try and make more money off of it. Like they're really making sure to sell it to people who, who grab that record and go, "Oh my, I never thought I'd see this in person on vinyl." Like, "Oh, I can't believe I get a chance to own this." Like that's literally who they're selectively selling it to. So for me, it works on both ends. Like I'm sad to not have the records anymore. But it makes me really happy the work that they're still doing for not only a local business, but for music lovers in that area.
Okay, that's nice to know. And one of the albums that survived and went with you, obviously, was A Sailor's Guide to Earth by Sturgill Simpson. Sturgill Simpson is, again, I think I've never heard of him before until you mentioned him. But again, country's not a genre that I'm that really well known. I'm not really au fait with. I don't think we've really had much country on the podcast. Closest we've got, I think, was the Scud Mountain Boys, and the album Massachusetts, but that had country elements, so you wouldn't probably class it as country as its main. I think it's kind of more like indie rock with country elements in it. And the Taylor Swift album that we covered on the podcast was Reputation, so it definitely wasn't a country album. Yeah, so it wasn't one of Taylor Swift's country albums. So Sturgill Simpson, born John Sturgill Simpson, an American country music singer and actor, and as of February this year, has released 7 albums as a solo artist. He's been nominated for Grammy Awards, been listed on best album lists for different albums, previous ones, and Sailor's Guide to Earth, his 3rd album. Now, I think he's based in, he was born from Jackson, Kentucky, and he's been classed as kind of outlaw country with elements of kind of country soul. So I think we might know more about this. So what exactly is outlaw country in comparison to what I might stereotypically think is country?
So outlaw country really goes all the way back to like Hank Williams Sr., and it's basically anybody who's not doing what mainstream country is doing at the time. So if you go all the way back to Hank Williams Sr., most country that was out at that time was very like Andrew's Sisters, very 3-part harmony driven about how everything's going to be okay and we're all going to be happy. Kind of the opposite of what most people would think the messaging in country music is, because it's known to be like a sad, forlorn genre, right? And Hank Williams Sr. went along singing about, all my exes live in Texas and there's a tear in my beer. And, he had very like, hey, there's this whole other side of life. So the phrase kind of got coined back then. And then you carry it through to in the 50s and the 60s, again, country was very much pushed into, everything is rosy and we're all going to be happy if we just love one another. And then you had folks like Johnny Cash that came along that was like, oh, and also there's, innocent men sitting in Folsom Prison and, and there's sad things going on. And then it carried on through the 70s, had a very rich history for outlaw country. And again, the counterculture of it with George Jones and Merle Haggard and even near the end of the 70s with Willie Nelson. So there's almost always at least one artist out there that's going completely against the grain, and it just gets titled outlaw country. And if you take a look now, and I don't mean to sound, elitist or anything along those lines, but what's considered country music now is not even close to the roots of country music. I mean, it's all pop songs that, as far as the visual aspects, they throw boots on someone and they're like, oh, that's country, and Sturgill is just completely off the rails, different from anything that's happening in mainstream country. So it's not even, his messaging isn't the same as what you would say was outlaw country early. It's just sonically what he does is so different from the mainstream that they literally give you a title of "you don't fit in," because he doesn't fit in with what they do. Everything in the Sturgill Simpson song and video is not we all go up to the lake and get drunk on our boat, which is what the messaging is in country music these days.
Yeah, when I heard the word country, I had kind of preconceived notions of what country music is. There's a very kind of strong stereotype. I don't know what it's like in the US, but you listen to country music. Well, you think of country music over here in UK, then you get the kind of impression of like straw hats, guitars, occasional slide guitars singing about trucks and beer and that kind of very stereotypical kind of like push mainstream kind of like what we've been seeing, what we kind of perceive as mainstream country. If anything, it's very similar to kind of like British folk, particularly when I used to listen, because I was quite into kind of folk music from a lot of UK artists about 10 years ago in the early 10s, and there's a lot of kind of wistfulness to it, but then you got elements like slide guitars and kind of almost Americana influence to it. It just verged from what would be country, which is like a very kind of almost very stereotypical. You can hear an accent in the singer as well and stuff. And when I got to this, part of me was expecting to hear that, and then when like the first song kicks in, it was like, okay, this is not what I expected from this. Yeah, and I can pick up there are elements of country music or what I perceive to be country in this album, but the fact that it's hidden under a lot more interesting stuff, that this kind of subverted my expectation to a point, and I'm assuming that's what the outlaw tag for the country is supposed to mean. Is that fair?
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah, I would say that's probably how Sturgill thinks of it, like as a badge of honor. Like, this is something different and not what you expected. When the badge is used in the media or within Nashville, like as an industry, it's very much meant as a slight. You don't fit in. And Sturgill, obviously I can't speak for him, but in interviews and things that I've looked up about him, he would look at that as, yes, that's a good thing. Like, I don't want to be like everyone else. And I want this to be something that nobody would expect. If you even look at, and I know we're here to discuss one specific record, but the album after this is called Sound and Fury, his fourth record. And the whole album is a garage fuzz rock album. Like, Ty Segall, like a very T-Rex, even Black Sabbath to some extent. The album after this is 100% different from this LP. There's not one lick of country sound on it at all. And so he's an artist that doesn't mind exploring other options, where Nashville very much says, no, you have to stay within this one label. So yeah, I would agree that that's what he was trying to do. But I think for him, it's a badge of honor. Whereas for Nashville, they very much want you to know that you don't fit in.
Okay. I find that quite interesting, particularly as well when I was reading this, it was actually recorded in Nashville. So it's quite interesting anyway. So A Sailor's Guide to Earth is his third album, and I think it was announced in March of 2016. He got released on April 15th, 2016 on Atlantic, and it was self-produced. It's 9 tracks, just underneath 40 minutes, which almost triggered a couple of Latham limit alerts. So if anyone not listening to this knows about my kind of penchants for songs that go on too long, but yeah, quite a few of these didn't push that. But yeah, so the album itself, we're looking into it, from what I'm gathering, it feels like it's a concept album where he's giving life advice to his son, and that echoes through, as well as what seems to be kind of reflecting on some of his past history when he was part of the naval service as well. Is that one of the things that's drawn you to it? Are you much a fan of concept albums or stories in music?
Yeah, very, very much. Exactly those two things. First of all, and it's funny that you mentioned that you're not a fan of long songs, because I grew up a huge Pink Floyd fan, who's, they're notorious for the, the 7, 8, 9, 20-minute song. But because of Roger Waters' writing style, as a very young person, I just fell in love with the idea of a concept album. It doesn't even have to be a big, grand point like the writing in The Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall is, but just a thing where you get a piece of art that is, very cohesive and all talks about the same thing. And then this one is such a fine point. Like you said, it's not just life advice in general. This is even the title of the record, Sailor's Guide to Earth, this is literally an album that his son or whomever is growing up can listen to and learn from, and use as a guide for life, or one man's perspective on, I'm not saying all the advice on here is perfect, but I just love that. And I also love storytelling songs, which is why I labored the point earlier about liking what I call, this sounds pretentious, but what I refer to as like real country. Like, I love a story to be told well. And I feel like this is like the apex of that. Like, both of those things meet together perfect here, where it's not only a concept record, but there's storytelling going on, and both are done, in my opinion, fantastically all at once.
The kind of album seems to also want to explore quite different sounds around kind of like the kind of country, but then expand from it. I mean, we like 2 minutes in and suddenly it goes from like what seems to be an orchestral, like you're watching like John Williams conduct an orchestra, before suddenly like a rock song starts, and then I think there are trumpets in the first song. I was like, okay, I didn't realise that country music had trumpets in it, and there's like a lot of interesting things happening with the music. So what elements of the actual music drew you in then? So so you talked about the kind of lyrical concept thing, but what about the actual music side of it? What was it that when you first heard it drew you in? So when you first, all the way back on that Friday night.
In many ways, I'm going to probably restate what you said to a certain extent. Right off the bat, the orchestrations, right from the top of the record, I was just like, oh, there's a lot more time, energy, and thought put into this than I was expecting, and I don't know why I had any expectation, but I did, and so that first, and then for me, when the really jazzy, hard-hitting horns start on the record from the third song on, Keep Between the Lines, I remember the first time I heard that song, when that song kicked in, I was like, we're really listening to something special here, and and that's the orchestrations are a theme throughout the rest of the record, but the jazzier horns and whatnot were, I think, the thing that made me go, wow, this is completely different than I was expecting. And something that's instantly accessible. Like, I feel like that song, Keep Between the Lines, you could play in almost any environment. And no matter what, like I said, near the top of the show, no matter what genre people are into, everyone in the room will find something to like about that song. So that's, for me, those horns were really the thing that drew me in and was like, oh, I need to really pay attention to this.
Yeah, and I think he kind of helps conjure what I think from what I've read, was kind of his intent in terms of like the themes of the album. So, so I remember reading something about part of an interview he did with Pace magazine, I think in around the time this was released, where they've talked about the idea of a sailor going through kind of rough seas and likening that to kind of life and everything. And the idea of wanting it to be a concept record. This is a quote from him, quote, "I knew I wanted to make a concept record in song cycle form, like my favourite Marvin Gaye records, where everything just continuously flows. I also wanted it to be something that when my son is older, and maybe I'm gone, he can listen to it and get a sense of who I was. I just wanted to talk as directly to him as possible," which then goes to the frame of kind of like the main kind of intent of the work. So you're not just having a concept album about a young Sturgill Simpson about time in the Navy and likening it to his current things. There's a framing device in that. It's that, but he also wants this story, but he's also as if he's telling his son this story, but also incorporating life voices, because there's all tangents and stuff. And the kind of like idea of him kind of doing that, I quite admire that bit, because it kind of ties everything together further in this concept. So it feels like a standard work. And as I've mentioned several episodes all the time in this podcast, I'm a fan of the album as an art form, in that I think the better albums, as like I will sit down and listen to an album as much as I can, rather than just like a playlist of stuff. So having something which has an intent to it, I think is quite strong, and I think that Sturgill Simpson did that well here.
Mm-hmm. And that ties back into what we were talking about with what we were trying to do at Music Night all those years, because I could not agree with you more about being a fan of the album as a format. And I think that there's so much lost these days. And when artists used to really put time and energy, not only into the songwriting and the production and everything, but artists would think about track listing and flow. And even if it wasn't a concept record, like how these pieces, individual pieces of art, are supposed to go together. So we used to have younger people that would come to Music Night, and they would pull, we'll say even something like a Bruno Mars LP, and they would pull it and they would say, oh, I really just want to hear the last song on side 2, that because it was the hit single or whatever. And so we would play all of side 2 straight through, right? And there would be people who would be like, oh, I've never even heard this song. Like, oh man, I love how that goes from this song to that song, and then eventually we'd get to and by the time we got to the song they wanted to hear in the first place, that was inconsequential, right? Because they had heard all this music they hadn't heard before, and it's enhanced by the fact that it's in album format. Like these songs were meant to be played in a certain order, right? And I feel like, I couldn't agree more that this record, obviously it's a concept album, so it does flow well on its own, but the way the sequencing is done is just perfect. Like the next song makes sense after the previous on in a row, 9 times in a row.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things happening with the sequencing and placements of certain songs on this. Actually, because we're starting to almost like on the verge of falling into talking about specific songs. Let's move on to the track. Let's move on to talking about the songs. And as always, I'll let the guest kind of choose where we want to start. So, which song do you want to start with?
It's hard for me. It's very hard for me not to go on in detail about every song on this record. So I'm going to skip directly to tracks 3, 4, and 5, because I just think that run, I think, is stunning. Keep Between the Lines, Sea Stories, and then what I feel is an incredible cover of In Bloom by Nirvana, which we'll circle back to in a minute. But prior to hearing this record, if you had told me that there was a country cover of In Bloom, I would have said to you, please make sure that I never hear that. And credit to the gentleman who played this record for me the first time. He didn't tell me that cover was there. Right. So we just put the album on, dropped the needle on side 1 and did our thing. And so anyways, to take it in order, like I say, I think the Dap Kings horn work on Keep Between the Lines is just stunningly good. And the band is, I don't want to say playing funk, but they're edging close to funk on the groove of this song. And this is really the first song of what you touched on, where it's Sturgill saying, I know no matter what I say as a dad, you're going to go out and you're going to get into some trouble. You're going to dabble in this, you're going to dabble in that, but just make sure, keep yourself under control, and it's the title of the song, keep Between the Lines. And I just love the messaging of the song. I think the groove on it is completely unexpected, and the horn work is just really something else. It's just this. Let me say this: this is the song that if someone is like you and says, I've never even heard of Sturgill Simpson, or even I'm not familiar with country, I don't like country, this is the song that I play first and go, okay, well, take a bite of this and see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, when this came on, this felt like, if you're out of a bar or club or something, and there's a live session band on, just for basically in a working men's club or something. It's not a gig, it's just someone who's just playing music for in a local or something. This is the kind of music you probably hear, where they're playing not party music, but it's that kind of jazzy kind of rock that's meant to get people going. Suddenly they're going to burst into covers of 1970s, 1960s kind of rock covers and stuff.
And like you said songs too, that freeform feel of it. One of my favorite things about this track is at the very, very top of the track, when you push play before the actual horns come in, you can hear the Dap Kings working out the horns with their voices, the parts that they're about to play. So it's like you said, that improv feel to it. I love that little snippet is there, where you hear these men with their voices figuring out what they're going to do, and then the horns kick in, and it's exactly the vibe you described.
Yeah, with that as well, I think that kind of helps with the idea that you're watching or hearing a story or a presentation of a story take place. So you could pretty much see this being played live front to back, as a play or a movie, or a book but with music in it. Go through, so you have that kind of moment where musicians, you can hear the musicians on stage just talking about what they're about to do next, and then that kicking in, which again goes to that feel of you're just watching these musicians live performing this and the story. I quite like the idea that he's talking about in terms of the lyrical bit, saying keep between the lines. Basically, I think perhaps in more kind of what I assume traditional country is when they're talking about road vehicles and trucks and stuff like that, the between the lines would be keep your truck, don't swerve off or veer off or whatever, and that kind, which is the advice that he's giving his son, but not going down the usual kind of pickup truck trope that you'll probably associate with country music, taking it with slightly different twist of things like the don't burn two lanterns at the same time, which is kind of spin on the candle at both ends thing, where it says don't work too hard, and I think it's quite nice kind of little plays on twisting usual kind of not tropes, but like sayings, or like just having a new spin on things. And I really quite like the kind of like lyricism involved in that in this one.
Then moving on from that, and this goes into what you were saying too about the overall advice for his kid, where his kid could listen to it, now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now, or whenever Sturgill's even gone, is the next song, Sea Stories, which I, as a person who my son, myself, he's 16 years old now. So I'm getting to the point in my life where I can share stories with my son that previously I may not have told him about what I was up to from say 16 to 25. Right.
Yeah. Here's why you shouldn't be an idiot at 16, because yeah.
Yes. And I love that this song is him. It's him basically telling his son, you're going to hear things about me, like either from me or, because he is a celebrity, you're going to hear things about things I did. And I love that when it goes in the chorus, he says, yeah, I got sea stories and they're all true, but the point of the song is, I'm not telling you to, do as I say and not as I do, but I'm telling you, like, I did that and some of it was really dumb. And so you don't have to do that as well. And I love that because of this record, now that I'm sharing some more stories with my own son about some things I did that were questionable in the past. I tell him from that perspective, like, you're going to live your own life, you're going to do your thing. But like, I can tell you there's a few things that it's cliche to say the phrase been there, done that. But I'm saying to my son, I can tell you already that doesn't end well, or the consequences weren't worth the fun we had on this particular situation, and what I find interesting about the instrumentation on this particular song is I love that the musically, sonically, this song is such a roller coaster ride. Like there's points of it that are very wild with this steel guitar solo and whatnot. And then there's a lot of the song calms way down. And to me, my perception as a listener is that mimics him reliving these wild stories with the son. But then when the song calms down, it's okay. This is more serious. I want you to listen to the advice part of this. And I just think that's mind blowing to me, especially in this day and age. I know the record's 6 years old now, but it's just not the quality of songwriting that we see these days, like that time and energy put into the way even the song happens sonically to go with the lyrics, I think is astounding.
This is probably the most kind of traditional country the album's gotten so far. So yeah, so the song sounds like it's more in-law country, pardon the pun. Yeah, so, and part of me is wondering whether that's kind of deliberate, in that there's like you got like kind of outlaw country, it's like going against the grain, but then falling back in line a bit to talk about this is perhaps where you need to stay in line, like I just said, or keep between the lines, but as mentioned previously, but yeah, so you're going to hear some kind of stupid stuff I've done and some like bizarre stuff that done as well. Also, this is probably in 96 episodes the first album to reference the video game GoldenEye, which it's again something that again you wouldn't expect in like a country album, but I do really quite like that verse starts with being quite poetic and kind of like with metaphors, saying sometimes sirens send a ship off course and the horizon gets so hazy, and like, oh yeah, so carry on with the whole like nautical theme, but linking it with not getting too specific about like things, and then suddenly goes maybe get high, play a little GoldenEye on that old 64, where it just gets where it kind of somehow manages to not date it because it's already a nostalgic when it was released, but gets quite direct and kind of like, oh, okay, wasn't expecting to specifically reference a Nintendo 64 game, particularly when seconds before he was using the kind of like idea of like, oh, the sirens of old of yore and like mythical creatures, and then go into like some really kind of mundane kind of like.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because this album is new to you. The very first that night that I heard this record for the first time, it was a social event, the music night. So we're all talking and carrying on and sipping on libations and whatnot. And then literally in the middle of that song, I said, did he just reference GoldenEye and the Nintendo 64? Yeah. And like you said, the contrast of the lyric before it and then that. And it's, no matter what generation you're from, one of these metaphors is going to speak to you,
Yeah. Then you probably get generations after this going, what's a 64? And then and then you're going to get older people saying, the Commodore 64. But GoldenEye wasn't on the Commodore 64.
Right. Yeah. I didn't even think about that. There's probably a certain amount of people that do think Commodore as soon as they hear 64.
Yeah. I think actually, my first ever game, well, it's not console, is it? The first ever thing that played games was the Commodore 64 when I was about 4 years old. So, I do quite like that kind of little reference, and again, kind of like the kind of brazen, kind of almost jarring shift to kind of like snap you back and stuff, and like you almost get whiplash where you're thinking, he's doing all these sea stories, all these kind of old, kind of perhaps slightly cliched references that, like, okay, everyone's going to mention sirens, and then suddenly goes, because I was surprised he didn't start saying Captain Ahab was like had a Saturn or something. Yeah, but it then leads to what I think's the most interesting decision creatively on this album, which you said, where it moves into a cover of Nirvana's In Bloom. I think I've only ever listened to Nevermind once all the way through, which is crazy considering that for nearly 2 years In Utero was like the favourite album that we've covered on this podcast so far. Before it's great. I think it's only been surpassed when Brian from Playlist Wars brought the Cars debut album. But In Utero is probably still a good close second. But I never actually listened to Nevermind all the way through. But In Bloom, I remember bits of. I can kind of remember, or at least if it's playing on in a club or something, I'm like, this is Nirvana. This is Nirvana, and it's not on an album that I'm not familiar with that well, and it's not Smells Like Teen Spirit, and it's not Linoleum. It must be In Bloom. I didn't recognise this was In Bloom at first until.
This is a couple of things about this track. Number one, like I said earlier, I've never flipped so hard on a song in my entire life as I did on this cover, because prior to hearing it, if you had told me that any country artist was covering In Bloom, or any Nirvana song but In Bloom, I would have said, please, thank you for telling me that, but please make sure that I never ever hear that, because I just assumed that there is no way that somebody would turn in a great cover of this song. And not only do I think this is an amazing cover, it's a complete reworking of the song in every way. It doesn't sound in any way other than the main melody. It doesn't sound in any way like the original. And one other thing that I personally love about this song is this is always the second song that I play for people off of this album, like right after Keep Between the Lines. If they like Keep Between the Lines, the next thing I do is I don't tell them what they're going to hear, but then I go, okay, now here's another track off the record. And as he's, like you said, you didn't like really realize what it was at first. I love watching that come over people's faces when they hear the first line, but it's sung in such a different way than it is on the original, that every single time someone hears this song, you can see their face be like, don't I know that? How do I know this one already? And then when it finally gets to the first chorus, you always see this look of come over. He's covering Nirvana. Oh my God, and I had the same realization myself the first time I heard it. As soon as he sang that first line, I was like, isn't that lyrics from In Bloom? How weird. And then the next line happens. Wait a minute. And then it moves in the chorus. I was like, this is a full blown cover. And I could not be more in love with the build on this all the way up to the end, when the full orchestrations and the full horns are going. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're saying, did he just say there's orchestrations and horns in a cover of In Bloom? Yes. And I think it's magnificent. It's one of the most, in an album filled with, in my opinion, amazing original songwriting moments. It's unbelievable how well this cover stands out.
Yeah, it fits in sonically with the album so far, in that it kind of does kind of some like interesting diversions or almost soul-like qualities in places before introducing kind of like the guitars, but then goes back to having some more of the kind of classical orchestral elements to it that have been in the past and so in like previous songs. And then when he gets to the chorus, it's like, oh yeah, and then kind of twists and adds his own kind of twist to the final line, which I found quite interesting, because he said that he adds to love someone at the end of the thing, where it's where I don't know what it means, but then he adds don't know what it means to love someone, and I quite like the story behind it, which there's an interview he gave with the New York Times where he just says that he simply misremembered the lyrics, so I quote: "But during the recording session, Mr. Simpson inadvertently changed the lyric in the chorus. He sang it the way he remembered from childhood, quote, but I don't know what it means to love someone. That last clause is an invention. To have it cleared, he had to write a very heartfelt letter to the administrators of Mr. Cobain's estate, who allowed him to release his version. Yet in the most humble of homages, Mr. Simpson has preserved his perspective. Even now, knowing what he says, he said, when I still listen to it, I still hear it my way." So I think apparently that he used to sing that to love someone when he was much, much younger, and it just stuck. And he didn't mean to sing it when he recorded it. So.
Yeah, I have plenty of songs that I do that with as well, that I just, when I was a little kid, I thought they said one thing, and that's just how I sing it now. But yeah, and it's interesting because it could also go with the theme of a lot of people say that they didn't really know what love was until they had a child or whatever, so you could think of it that way as well, that now that he has a child, like now he does know what it means to love someone, which I might be reading a little too much into that. Could be just exactly that, a lyric flub, but for me, it puts that spin on it as well.
Yeah. And I think it kind of fits in with the themes of what the album's talking about. There's another quote from Rolling Stone Country that Sturgill Simpson gave in March, where he was like stating that it feels autobiographical to him, even though it's Kurt Cobain's song. Quote: "I wanted a song on the album to capture that awkward stage in every boy's life where they were searching for their place in the world. One night, while discussing the album with my wife, she asked, 'Well, what were you listening to when you were 13? I remember in 7th or 8th grade when Nevermind dropped. It was like a bomb went off in my bedroom. For me, that song has always summed up what it means to be a teenager. And I think it tells a young boy that he can be sensitive and compassionate. He doesn't have to be tough or cold to be a man.'" Which, again, feels like good life advice, which feels like it fits in with that. So again, you can kind of imagine if this is Simpson saying all this stuff that's covered in the album to his son. He goes, "Hang on, let me just play you this song. Let me just play you this song I listened to when I was your age," and plays Nevermind, and then continues to tell the story. It's a very interesting kind of decision to do that, which somehow fits in with the rest of the album, and kind of keeps the flow and doesn't feel out of place, which like other albums that might just have stuck in a cover because the artist likes it, it might not have segued in that well. It's just there because the person singing it, the singer / band, loved their song. But yeah, there's a lot of cleverness, in the way it fits into this that I really do admire.
Yeah, I was absolutely stunned by the quality of it, and like you said, the forethought that's put into, like you said, hey, you could do Teen Spirit or Come As You Are or something that's even, more well known, I would say, than In Bloom, but this particular song fits in with the narrative so well that that's the one that he was going to, and it doesn't feel forced at all. And, and to wrap things up on my little stand here on my favorites, this section of the record, Keep It Between the Lines, Sea Stories, and In Bloom, everything that we discussed earlier about the flow of the album, the way it's put together, the purposefulness behind each track, I feel like everything I've said positive about the record can be demonstrated by just listening to those 3 tracks in a row. So for me, there's nothing on the record that I dislike, but if you got to pick your absolute favorites on the record, those 3 for so many reasons. It's not just 3 good songs in a row. It's 3 songs that completely complement each other, that in their own way, every song of the 3 subvert expectations and exceed expectations at the same time. It's just really an amazing section of the LP.
Yeah, and a slight tangent. I'm wondering whether Outlaw Country is the go-to kind of cover, because as I was listening to this, the thing that kept jumping into my mind, even as we were still talking about stuff as well, was the Johnny Cash version of Hurt, where it recontextualizes the song into something that even the original writer was like saying, well, crap, it's not my song anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
We just covered that cover on, we do a thing on our show every couple of weeks, cover battles, where we'll just put an original versus that. And I was talking about how in the original version of Hurt, near the end, the vocals are pushed up on purpose to the point of distortion, and Trent Reznor is near screaming to make his point, and then Johnny Cash takes that and turns it around completely, where he's barely even raising his voice, and there's as much or more urgency on those lyrics.
It's like the piano just gets louder and louder and louder, like he's using every last ounce of strength he can to like break through the keys of the piano and stuff. And that I think to this day that is like one of my favorite covers of all time. But instead to avoid trying to get onto like a massive tangent where we talk about that song for about an hour, but that kind of breaking down of a song to its basic cause and reapplying it to the person covering its life and where it is at this time, it kind of allows a songwriter to find some like meaning in someone's words and being able to apply themselves and like relate to it to the point where it's like this song, like I relate to this song and it means so much to me. It also relates to a certain point, but then also being able to put it in, actually recording it and putting it out there for people to listen to, and then people saying, I can see how someone can take this and apply their own meaning to it. So I think anyone who's not listened to the Sturgill Simpson album, it feels very similar to perhaps what Johnny Cash was doing with Her, in terms of, okay, this is what I think this song can apply to me at this time. And it must be kind of the kind of Outlaw Country that it's the genre to cover things with.
Right. And I feel like in the way, like Hurt obviously is far more commercial, like way more people have heard that cover than this. But one of the biggest things for me, whenever I play that cover for someone, almost every time if I get into a conversation, I tell them a little bit about the background of the album and how it's a concept album and so on. Almost every single time someone will say, I would have never thought of that song that way. And for all the reasons you just said, it's a complete reworking of the meaning of the song with outside of the last line, not changing a thing lyrically. And it causes people who have, Nevermind is in the Air Supply. Everyone knows almost every song on Nevermind. Like you said, you don't even listen to the complete record and you hear it, all the time. And to do a song in such a way that is so familiar with people and have every person I've played it for say nearly exactly the same thing you just said. I never thought of the song that way before. This is a complete reworking of the song. I think that's the biggest compliment you could pay a cover.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really kind of amazed that when I went to go and listen to the original, I was like, I can't believe it's the same song. So I say we perhaps got time for just a couple more tracks to talk about. Is there any that you want to mention next?
I could focus in on one, and because of two totally different aspects about it, and that the album closer, Call to Arms, which the messaging I think is absolutely brilliant. It's in it, and in many ways it's by far, in my opinion, the most rockin' song on the record.
You know, it reminded as I was listening to it, as I was just quickly going for the album again before we started recording, it reminded me a little of if they ever remade Back to the Future and they wanted to redo the Johnny Be Good. In my head, I've got Marty McFly playing this at the dance. Like this, it's that kind of music. It's that kind of rock and roll music. Like goes,
yeah,
John, it's your cousin Marvin Simpson.
Yeah, you know that new sound you were looking for?
Yeah. Listen to this.
It's such a rockin' cut, and again, I think musically it's done on purpose. It's kind of like, okay, we had that talk, good talk, you know, like now let's have some good times, and then lyrically it's absolutely fantastic. But the other thing, and this is kind of outside the LP, and I think at the top you said we were going to discuss if I had seen him live, which we can still get into because I have seen him in concert. But if anybody would like an example of what a powerhouse Sturgill Simpson is as a live performer, you can look up, I'm sure you can just go to YouTube and search for this, but he did Call to Arms on Saturday Night Live. And it is, I think they still have to rebuild the Rockefeller Center from that performance because he tore the roof off of Studio AH. It's one of the best live performances I've ever seen on Saturday Night Live, and I have a rich history with the program. I'm not saying that from, I've seen the Beastie Boys and Elvis Costello together. Like I've seen all the storied SNL performances, and that performance by Sturgill of Call to Arms on Saturday Night Live is just ripping. I mean, with zero regard for what anybody in the studio audience might think or the televised audience. You can tell this guy is he knows he's not the usual pop star that Saturday Night Live has, and he just leans into it. And this is it's the album closer. It's a great statement to make on your way out the door. And it's wasn't even released as a single. It got no airplay. And I think that's such a bold move to do that song on Saturday Night Live when really, he could have walked out and done the In Bloom cover for one and, say Keep Between the Lines for another and made a ton of fans that night. But instead he goes out and does his album closer and does it even better than the record. Again, with that outlaw country in mind of like, yeah, I know I don't fit in. So here's a song that, you will either blow you away or you will know you never want to hear from me again. So that's one I would definitely mention.
But yeah, the kind of dancing, like the dance aspect to it, again, going back to like earlier in the album where I said you can vision this live, you get the same kind of feeling with this one here. And yeah, where like it's the bit where you suddenly have like you have solos from the guitarist and you have the keyboards, like kind of where they kind of improvise. Feels like they're improvising their solos on stage, where like you'll have like the guitar for 12 bars and you have the piano for 12 bars and stuff. I think it's really great. It's funny as well. I think it's really great. When you mentioned that it was on like Saturday Night Live, but then because it's Saturday Night Live, that makes a bit more sense that they would have a song where it's kind of almost the lyrics itself is critical about armed conflict, which again, I think a song that was released in 2016 feels relevant now in 2022 as well as pretty much even beforehand. And I think that's it's again quite interesting. Again, going down to the stories, going down to the idea of the concept of his time in the Navy, and was he thrown? Did he quit or was he thrown out? I couldn't figure that out.
I have never read a straight story on that, so I don't know exactly.
Yeah,
I've read everything all over the map about that, so I'm not entirely sure.
yeah. So sometimes, there's occasions where he said he left, and sometimes he says that because he was probably sitting getting high playing GoldenEye that he got thrown out.
Yeah.
But again, that kind of story, I think the ending, it feels like, oh yeah, what was my point? Oh yeah, I joined the Navy. You don't have to because don't do it, or because of all this and stuff, and I'm not a fan of the military, and this is why, blah blah blah. Anyway, yeah, we must go. Dinner's ready.
Yeah.
So
and that's another point that speaks to the outlaw country too, is here in America, country is very much a patriotic, you know, I mean, one of the biggest country songs of all time is God Bless the USA, you know, and there's all the tropes of, you know, my wife left me, my dog left me, the truck broke down. But almost in every one of those songs at some point is, but God loves the USA, you know, at some point.
Yeah.
And when you come out with this type of messaging, Nashville and the country industry as a whole is like, no, that's not what we say around these parts.
It's unpatriotic and everything, yeah. Because again, going back to the external kind of non-American view of country music, it feels, again, the kind of like pro-military kind of Uncle Sam imagery, but with the bald eagle and the American flag and everything. That again is there's a lot of crossover in what we perceive to be country music, and again, I think the Outlaw tag appears to just basically allow him to express more freedom of opinion on that. And again, I feel it's quite strong. Again, I was fully not expecting a kind of anti-military album that had the country tag on it. So again,
you know, I mean, we have guys over here, like there's a cat named Toby Keith who has made pretty much his entire career for the past 20 years has been every song that he can put out being like, isn't our military great? You know, like, and to me, as you know, I've worked in marketing my whole life, and as a music appreciator, to me, I see it as exactly that. Like when he puts that out, I'm like, you're just selling records based on, you know, people's emotions about the military, you know, and patriotism, and you're playing directly to people who have lost family members or whatever in the service, or currently have family members in the service, and you're gaining your record sales on that emotional manipulation, in my opinion. And so takes a lot, whether you agree, whatever side you fall on, it takes a lot for an artist to have a different stance, you know, when there are artists who have built a whole industry out of being pro.
I mean, on balance, there's probably some comfort. Some people probably find comfort in a pro-military stance, particularly if they've got like people, like family members in the military. And let's say, I think my personal politics aside, who are kind of anti-military, that's fair enough for them. It's the same with religion. I mean, I was quite one thing that I was expecting on this album that I didn't really find much of unless I didn't read into it was anything to do with religion, because I do feel there's like the stereotype is a very kind of religious, very Christian kind of message, but again, unless I've missed it, I didn't feel anything about religion on this album, but I don't think it might have been the intent of it.
Yeah, I feel like not even one way or the other. Like with military, the only time that it comes up, it's playful in songs like Sea Stories and whatnot, but then it's, you know, a very anti-message with something like Call to Arms. But religion doesn't come up one way or the other on this. And I feel like maybe that in and of itself is a message of, you know, go find your own path and believe what you want to believe. Because you hit the nail on the head as far as country goes. That's right there beside patriotism in core mainstream country is almost always, you know, and like I say, even, you know, the most well-known country song that there is in this country is God Bless the USA. So you got both right there in the title, you know, and not to be found on this record at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things particularly with this song as well, and if we've, I mean, again, this is towards the kind of southern middle. I think southern. If my geography, if my geography is correct, kind of South Middle America. There's a slight, I think, in terms of subject matter, there's a lot of kind of crossover with the Heartland rock, which is slight towards like where Bruce Springsteen. So I think we covered Darkness on the Edge of Town, Bruce Springsteen, a few years ago now, but that was before Born in the USA. And I think elements of this kind of reminded me of that kind of Born in the USA, where it seems like, okay, Born in the USA, I think, is supposed to sound like it's patriotic when it's actually quite not. And I think if you compare that to this as well, this has got that kind of, it doesn't even make any attempt to try and sound like a patriotic song. It's they're going, this is the call to arms, but it's very critical, which I think particularly if you compare that to, I can't remember when Born in the USA was out. Was it the 80s?
84. I want to say 84.
Oh, okay, it's older than I thought it was. Yeah, I think from there, like 30 odd years afterwards, you're able to be almost more direct with that. But yeah, there's kind of like a crossover with like almost like the sentiment of Heartland rock in places. Which,
Mellencamp, Springsteen, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I always remember when Born in the USA came out is because that's one of the more famous and misguided attempts at a politician trying to connect with the mainstream, is that when Ronald Reagan was running in 84 for the presidency, he famously tried to use License Born in the USA as his theme song. And it was Bruce Springsteen who had to be like, maybe you haven't listened to the entire lyrics of Born in the USA, but I wouldn't run for president using that song. You know? So,
yeah. There's been a couple of UK versions of that. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure there's been a couple of times where politicians have used songs, and then I think on Twitter the people have gone, no, you're not using our song. Yeah, you're against everything. Actually, I'm pretty sure. Like, for example, years, almost a decade ago, then Prime Minister David Cameron said his favourite band was the Smiths, and then it was Johnny Marr going, no, because you're against, no, because the political party you are is against what the Smiths.
Right. Mm-hmm.
No, yeah. So
and it's happening again here now today, without going off on a big tangent, but here now today with elections coming up again here in the US, there are people on a certain side of the fence who have tried to use songs by Rage Against the Machine, and Rage Against the Machine keeps being like, you guys know we don't fit your messaging, right? You know, you can't just take one lyric from one song and put it in an ad and go, yeah, these are our guys, you know, like, no, everything you say is the total opposite of what we say. So
my favorite genre of tweet and Instagram comment at the moment is people who go like, Rage Against the Machine don't know anything about politics, they should really keep politics out of music, when in fact perhaps the most qualified musician like Tom Morello is like, he's like is he a political science major or something? And
I just saw 3 nights ago, as of this recording, I just saw Roger Waters again in concert, and first of all, it always astounds me when people say, oh, I wish Roger Waters would shut up about politics. And it's like, if back when Corporal Clegg came out from Pink Floyd in 1968 was the first time Roger Waters talked about politics. And then he continually talked about it on all of these Pink Floyd songs that you supposedly love, you know, and now somehow you've just realized that he should stop talking about politics. But all of that is to say, when the show started the other night, there was a big message on the screen that said, the show is going to begin in 5 minutes. If you're one of those people who says, I love Pink Floyd, but Roger should keep his politics out of it, now would be a good time for you to leave. Which I thought was hilarious.
But yeah, that's all kind of like a whole other discussion that we probably won't have time to get into.
Right.
In terms of its performance and reception, it was done quite well in terms of reception wise. It's got like 4 out of 5 on All Music. It got 4 out of 5 in The Guardian, A- in Entertainment Weekly, and of course the one that always interests me, the Pitchfork review, which is a very strong and sturdy 8 out of 10. Which again, which is probably like 12 out of 10 in normal websites, apparently. Normal websites. Yeah, but again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but he just mentions stuff about he's saying like it's like forging a new way forward for his like sound and stuff. So it's done relatively well in terms of like critical stuff. In terms of its performance in the weekly charts, it got to number 1 in the US folk, got to number 1 in the US country, got to number 1 in the US rock, and number 3 in the Billboard 200. Got to 31 in Canada, 34 in Norway, got to 43 in the UK. Yeah, and it hit year-end charts. So it was like the 5th best folk album in 2016, 18th in the Billboard country. And in 2017, he was still in there as well, with 24th in the US folk and 75th in top country in 2017. So yeah, so it has done well. It's done well creatively and stuff. In terms of its reception and everything. So,
and what's interesting about the reception is a quick point I want to make is that if you notice, it was also nominated for Country Album of the Year at the Grammys, and it was also nominated for Album of the Year at the Grammys. Now, it won the Country Album of the Year at the Grammys. Didn't win Album of the Year, but it did win Country Album of the Year. This record was famously ignored by, there are two different, there's the ACA's, the Academy of Country Music Awards here in the US, and then there's the CMA's, the Country Music Awards. And this album was famously ignored by both of those award shows, not nominated for anything, let alone even production. Sometimes you get that an album that's a darling of the press and it gets ignored by, say, like the award shows, but they'll at least acknowledge the production with a nomination or something along those lines. And this record did not even receive any nomination at either of the major country awards. And you talk about Outlaw and cool things for an outlaw to do. The night of the CMA presentation was at the Bridgestone Arena there in Nashville, and Sturgill Simpson went live on Facebook outside at the entrance of the Bridgestone Arena, and he had his acoustic guitar and his guitar case open as if he was a regular busker, and he was just standing there belting out tunes, just him and his guitar. And you could hear people would walk by every so often and be like, that guy sounds just like Sturgill Simpson, or like, be like, oh, that dude kind of looks like Sturgill Simpson. So finally a total stranger walks up to Sturgill and he says, you're Sturgill Simpson, right? He says, yeah. He said, well, what are you doing out here? The coolest answer in the history of the world. Sturgill says, well, I heard they were giving out awards for country music inside, so I thought at least some country music should get played here tonight. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you talk about outlaw and outsider, the dude literally stood outside the awards where they chose to make it clear that you're not one of us, and then just laid him low with that that statement.
Throwing shade.
Yeah. So I was like, that's my guy. Yeah, it was great.
Wow. That's like throwing shade, like no one's business.
All of that is to say that I think it's incredible that the record had the reception that it did everywhere except for in the country community.
So I'm assuming that still didn't endear him to the country community after that.
Oh yeah, believe it or not, no, that did not. And I would argue the next LP that followed this, Sound and Fury, with it being there's nothing country about the record after this. There's no horns, there's no orchestration. It's a straight fuzz rock record. And I'm sure country was like, see, he's not one of us,
Okay. So, talking about Simpson playing live, have you ever seen him live?
I have. I've seen him twice. I saw him at the very, very tail end of the tour for this record. And then I saw him once on the tour for the following album, the Sound and Fury, which was interesting because the show that I saw at the very end of this tour, the Sailor's Guide to Earth tour, there was no opener for that show. It was just him and his band. And I'll circle back to that in 1 second. But the next tour that I saw him on was Sound and Fury, which again, I've labored the point, is in no way a country record. And he had an artist open for him that night that was as country gets. Steel guitars, songs about trucks, I mean, as country could be. And I just thought, why is this guy opening this tour? Like the fuzz rock album, and then Sturgill came out and did what he did. He played, he opened that show by playing his new album in its entirety, front to back, and not a country song in sight, so it was interesting. But the first time that I saw him, I figured that there would be at a minimum horns and possibly some orchestration if you were going to do songs from this record, because you're touring for this album. And we walked in and there wasn't even a tarp behind him. Like, you see the big, in that, there certainly wasn't a big video screen, but there wasn't even like a big banner that said, Sturgill Simpson or the album artwork or whatever you might see. And there was a 3-piece drum kit, a Les Paul on a guitar stand, a bass on a guitar stand, and a keyboard. And it was like the brick wall of the Fox Theater behind him. Like, it was the most plain setup. And the whole time before he came out, I kept thinking, I don't know, maybe before he comes out, they're going to come out, like they'll bring some horns out or something. Nope. Lights went down. 4 of them walked out. Sturgill picked up his Les Paul, and then they just did strip down on the ballads, but like straight rock versions of everything on this record. So it was like, there were songs on this album, like Sea Stories, for example, that it took me halfway through the first verse. And I was like, oh, this is Sea Stories. Like, he had already completely reworked the songs from how they appear on the album. And it didn't take anything away from it for me. I could see people maybe going in there expecting to hear the album, not note for note, but expecting to hear the things the way they were on the record. And I was blown away from number one, to rework the songs that quickly when you're still on tour for the record. And 2, to have the guts to do that as an artist, to not come out and play the songs exactly as they sound on the LP. So it was really something. It's one of, I've seen, I don't know, probably 1,000 concerts in my time. I've seen some of the biggest names that in the history of music, and it's in the discussion with one of the greatest shows I've ever seen.
Wow. And that's and again, that's not with like even half the instrumentation required for the
right.
Yeah, I'm assuming it was more a case that they managed to translate that to a different kind of vibe. So yeah. So, yeah, I've seen that where some bands where perhaps members have left with certain instruments and they've had to rework older stuff without like violins or anything like that, and they just sound as good. Yeah, so there's like they've got like a second guitarist coming through and stuff and everything. So so how long's it been since you've seen him live then? So when was that last one? Was that several years ago then? Or?
I want to say it would have been at least, I want to say 2018 maybe was the last time that I saw him live. And then of course, he hasn't really toured since then. He's put out, after that Fuzz Rock record, he put out 2 back-to-back albums, which are, again, roller coaster ride. He has 2 albums called Cutting Grass Volume 1 and 2. And those 2 albums consist of completely bluegrass reworkings of songs from his first 3 albums. So it's a stunning move. And then his latest came out, I want to say probably about a year ago now, just off the top of my head. And that's a straight country affair, but he has yet to tour for that. And of course, everything, the whole touring industry got shut down for a couple of years there. But to my knowledge, he hasn't toured for his latest effort yet.
Oh, okay. So, and I mean, you touched on quite a few of his albums briefly, but if people who've not want to move on to other albums, where would you recommend they go next?
Honestly, overall, I would say, well, I get, it depends on what you like about this record. If you like the country elements of it, I would tell you to go back to the 2 before it, because the 2 before it are, for everything that you're saying complimentary about this record, subverting expectations of the country genre. The first 2 records fall squarely into expectations of the country genre. If you like the rockin', more experimental and out there tones that are found in parts of Sailor's Guide, then I would tell you to go directly to the next one, Sound and Fury. And especially if you like any, like I say, fuzz rock, garage rock type things, even if you're like a White Stripes fan or a T-Rex or anything along those lines, I would tell you to go directly to the next record, Sound and Fury. And then really, to be honest, Cutting Grass is 1 and 2 are, like I say, they're bluegrass reworkings of songs from this record and the 2 before it. So, unless you're super duper in a mood to hear these same songs reworked in a different fashion, that's not one that I would recommend. So it just depends on what you like from this album. If you like the country aspects, go to the 2 before it. If you like the rock inside of it, go directly to Sound and Fury after it.
Oh, okay. So that garage rock one sounds interesting. So I might go into that. I might have a quick listen to that because that one sounds interesting. But yeah, we're reaching the end of our conversation, Russ, and we got the important question now, which is the song for the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist. Now, anyone who's not listened to this before, what this is that I asked a guest being Russ for this episode, to pick one song from this album to be immortalised forever on the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist. And so Russ has the honour of choosing a song to follow Hoppy Poller by Sigur Rós and I Wish You Well by Josie and the Pussycats. So which song are you going to add on to that? So you've got Josie, then you've got Sigur Rós, and then which Sturgill Simpson song from this album you're going to add on to it?
This is such a tough decision for all of the reasons we just discussed. But I'm gonna stick with the one I always go to, that I always play first for anybody off of this record, and that's keep it between the lines.
So yep, Keep It Between the Lines. Okay, so that's now added on to the playlist. That's probably track number 96 on that ever-growing playlist. That's a really good section I would like to listen to, where you've got Meds by Placebo, Review Mirror by Pearl Jam, you've got 2 by Shakira, then you've got Josie and the Pussycats, and then Sigur Rós, and then Sturgill Simpson. That's a very nice eclectic journey to go through, I think. So that was Sturgill Simpson's A Sailor's Guide to Earth. Russ, thank you ever so much for coming on, introducing me to some outlaw country. I've definitely learned a lot in terms of country and basically that side of the industry and the outlaw country of stuff. It's been a nice. It's always nice to dabble in genres that I'm not really that familiar with, and I think that's not really been covered on the podcast as much. So thank you for that.
And this, for me, that because of the music night thing we did, it was the same thing for me. Like, I only came into this record and a love of this record because someone else brought it to me in an environment that I would have never had access to it on my own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if people want to find you and listen to your podcast, where can they find you?
Easiest way, well, any podcast platform that you're on, you can look for the Infectious Groove podcast. You can go right to infectiousgroovepodcast.com, and that has all of our episodes there and links to every player so whatever player you might use, you can find us and subscribe there. We also have a YouTube channel, which is completely different. It's music based, but it's completely different content. Like, I don't just post the podcast episodes to YouTube. We have 2 videos a week that are quick bites, like 5-minute discussions of 5 most underrated this, or 5 types of this song you might not have ever heard before, or 5 albums that didn't get as much love as they would have. And without going on too in depth about my show, what we do on our show is, as much as possible, we keep it positive. I don't feel the need to insult any art that somebody put any amount of time into. And I certainly don't want to insult something that might be important to someone else. So if something isn't my cup of tea or my co-host's cup of tea, we just don't cover it. We just keep it out of our show. To me, in this internet age of clicks and everyone trying to make a splash, it would be easier to do a show of hot takes and, for looking for clicks. Here's the 5 most overrated songs of the last 5 years. And then you inevitably insult something people love and you stir up emotion. And I understand that that's a super easy way to get recognition and be recognized in a notorious way. But to me, there's a lot more to discuss about what's underrated or what more people should hear or what more people should love. And so that's what we do on our show. And so if you like the way that I've been talking about music here on this episode, by all means, come and check us out as well. It's myself, and I have 2 co-hosts with me. It's a weekly show, and we have the YouTube aspect as well. So, but I cannot stress enough, I greatly appreciate you having me on your show. And I'm glad, this may not be an album that goes in your, all-time favorite records of all time, but I can just tell by how you're talking about it, even if this isn't something that you love, I can tell that you have a great appreciation for the record. And I love that. I just love that, it's something you weren't even interested in genre wise. And you're, dug in enough to really give respect to the art that's there. And I just love that. So thank you for having me on in the first place. And then thank you for giving so much attention to a record by an artist you hadn't even heard of prior to this.
Yeah, no, I was saying, as I said earlier, I never heard of Sturgill Simpson before. My knowledge of country, again, very, very different, and is a lot more complex than I realised because of this thing. So, thank you ever so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Pick a Disc, and I've been your host, Matthew Latham. Our theme music is Pump by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Pick a Disc is hosted by the We Made This podcast network, and you can find them on www.spreaker.com/user/We Made This. You can find the Pick a Disc show site on www.spreaker.com/show/pickadisc. You can find us on all the usual social media type places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Pick a Disc. You can also email us on pickadisc@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening to all those discs that you are picking. Goodbye.
100 years since Nosferatu first terrified audiences on the big screen.
30 years since Francis Ford Coppola gave us Bram Stoker's Dracula.
And 10 years since Dark Shadows of Johnny Depp.
Vampire Videos is a podcast taking a look at this iconic blood-sucking monster on film and television.
I'm Dan Owen.
And I'm Hugh McStay.
And we're here to guide you through a century of vampirism on film. From Hollywood's golden age with Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula,
to the more lurid hammer horrors of the 60s and 70s starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
Through to the 80s boom in vampires, which brought these creatures of the night into the modern age.
And everything this century's had to offer us, from foreign and independent films, spoof comedies, and even teenage love stories. Yes, I'm talking about Twilight.
We aim to cover it all, one bite at a time.
So join us on a voyage into the depths of vampire cinema, old and new, with weekly guests offering their own insights and expertise. And why not follow us on Twitter @VampVideos?
A proud part of the We Made This podcast network, subscribe now to Vampire Videos, and thanks for listening.